So here we have this wonderfully familiar gospel, the road to Emmaus. And I'd like to follow on from our two previous Sundays, showing how Jesus is drawing close to people, doesn't follow things they understand, is not obvious. They don't know what's going on. And yet he wants to make himself present. There is a giving of himself to them that is to take them beyond themselves. We saw that with Mary Magdalene, we saw that with Thomas, and now we're going to see it with Cleopas and friend as they head to Emmaus. So there they are. They're walking out of town, heading nowhere in particular, this outside village, which no one has been able to identify. And they've heard about the visit of Mary Magdalene and other women to the tomb. They know that something is very strange, and they can't make sense of it. So while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. So a third person appears, but he's not a third person whom they recognize. Again, the risen Jesus is never obvious. But their eyes were kept from recognizing them, and he said to them, "What's this conversation that you're holding with each other as you talk, as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. That downcast mien, the same downcast mien that Pharaoh's butler and baker had in prison when Joseph came upon them and asked, "Why are you standing still looking sad?" And then Joseph offered to interpret them all the things that were in their dreams. So here Jesus is about to do exactly the Joseph role, which St. Luke very cleverly hints at us with that little phrase, "They stood still looking sad." It's a direct quote from Genesis. One of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" Okay, here's the thing. So the crucified and risen Lord is walking alongside these two, and their first presumption is that he's not from there. He's a visitor, a sojourner, someone who's coming through, a resident alien, but someone who doesn't get it. They picked up in his accent. Something about him gives away the fact that he couldn't really understand it. And I think that's hugely important. The voice of the risen one is going to come to us from a strange place. It's always going to be experienced by us as a strange turnaround. So Cleopas says, "You're the only one who doesn't understand these things." Jesus says, "What things?" Not, I think, to play silly with them, but because it's only in the degree to which they start trying to tell their story that they'll come to an end of the story. That they'll screw up and realize that their story, as they're telling it, doesn't make sense. And it's only then that he will be able to intervene and start to give them the unified account of what's really been going on. But he'd only do that if they're not just being sullenly silent and saying, "No, you wouldn't get it." It's as they start to try and explain to him, no doubt very condescendingly and in a muddled way, what's going on, that he's going to be able to get into their story and turn it round. And that's what happens. They said concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. So they've got a variety of different lines in their story. He was a man, he was a prophet, was strong before God, but our chief priests and rulers, who theoretically should have been in favor of someone like him, handed him over to the Romans to be crucified, And yet we had hoped that he was the one to restore Israel, because there was a prophecy. There is a prophecy concerning the one who was going to come and restore Israel, bring back the new temple, perform the ultimate sacrifice, bring to an end the temple. This was all part of our expectation. And now it's the third day since these things have happened. Some women of our company amaze us, but of course women, their capacity to give witness is, they're second-rate witnesses under law. So we had to go along and see whether what they said was true. And yes, it was. It was just what the women had said. But although they said they had seen him and a vision of angels, we didn't see. In other words, they've got it out. They've made themselves vulnerable, if you like, in their attempt to tell a story and not really be able to make sense of it. And so now he's able to speak to them, "O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" In other words, what he's saying is, there's always been a single unitary story going on here. Something has been happening that was always going to happen, and in the light of which everything will become perfectly clear. All the prophets have been telling about it, and now I'm going to explain it to you. I'm going to explain the full unitary sense of what's going on, of what's been going on. And says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So at this stage, please remember, he's outside them. He's a third person, not an obvious teacher, because not the kind of person who they would expect to take very seriously. And yet he is offering them a unified account of all the things in their scriptures which had been fulfilled over the last few days, which is basically everything. It must have been an extraordinary exercise in having their world turned upside down as they discovered all the things that had in fact, just over the last few days, been echoed, foretold in Isaiah, in Zechariah, and all the prophets. And it's difficult for us to do it now, but it's amazing how much richness of interpretation of things that are being fulfilled can be found. So there he was, doing this, giving them a completely new take on the story which they already knew, the take that was not obvious, that would not have come from somebody who they would have taken seriously. So this is the strangeness of this thing. They've got someone outside themselves, from not a very respectable position, is giving them the whole thing. They then draw near to the village where they're going, and now they invite him in. They invite him into their home. And I think this is very important for us as we find ourselves celebrating these Eucharists in our homes. The voice has come from outside. We have to learn to hear the unexpected, the strange, the not very reputable voice, challenging us to turn our sense of what's really happening upside down. And then with them in the home, he is their guest, and yet he performs a gesture which is the gesture of a host, breaking the bread, blessing it and giving it to them. In other words, suddenly they find that the one who they thought they were hosting is the one who has been hosting them. And immediately they perceive that all that he had been telling them, as if about a third person, was in fact, I am. He had been telling them in the first person about what he had been doing and what he was including them in. And of course, immediately they grasp that it was actually not a third person who was speaking to them, but it was the first person narrative. They realize that this is a theophany, this is the presence of the Most High. And immediately he's gone. In all theophanies, in all glimpses of the Most High, he's gone in the glimpse. And that is the case here. So now they've heard the story from the one who was telling it. So their version is no longer muddled. They're now able to speak with confidence about what had really been going on. They go back and they tell those who are gathered in Jerusalem, who reply, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." In other words, they share the same story. And it's one of the reasons why I like what we're given in the first reading today, is that our first reading for the day is actually Simon Peter, essentially giving the straightened out version of the story that the disciples in Emmaus were giving the muddled version of. In other words, now that the risen Lord has been amongst them and shown that he was in fact the protagonist, that it was deliberate, this was something that he was doing, they are now able to tell the story straightforwardly from his perspective. And that is exactly what happens in the reading from the Acts of the Apostles. Peter is able to basically tell the story that the disciples on the road to Emmaus were not able to tell. So, as we celebrate our Eucharists at home, let's remember that the word coming from outside, from this preacher, from many other much better preachers, but also from strange voices that you may hear talking about completely different things, which nevertheless turn out to have an expertise that completely throw you and surprise you. And I'm not talking about strange recommendations for disinfectant here. Our world being turned upside down and us being given a new perspective. Oh my God. I'm actually being invited here rather than running the show. And the one who is giving himself to me is giving himself to me as my host, even as I thought I had hosted him. What I hope and pray for you all with this Eucharist is that we are able to follow the paradigm that was opened up for us on the road to Emmaus and share in the presence of the Most High, who gives himself to us and reveals himself in the breaking of the bread.